So in this lecture, we're going to talk about the origins of slavery in British America. We're going to talk a little bit about the Middle Passage, but a lot of the activity that you're going to engage in is going to cover quite a bit of this. So I won't go into too much detail on this, but hopefully this will give you a little bit more background into the origins of slavery in British America, in the Americas itself. So the first thing to really understand is that triangular trade becomes a thing with the growth of colonies in the Americas. And essentially, it links Europe, Africa, and the Americas in this system of trade. And it's called triangular trade. It didn't really make a perfect triangle, but it kind of looked like that because it was touching the three different colonies. And so I'm going to show you a slide next. It's going to give you kind of a visual of it. And in this one, you can see in a little more detail, you can see, where it's going to, what was being traded and things of that nature. Now, on the west coast of Africa, this is where the slave trade and people were involved in the slave trade. So a couple things I want to talk about. First of all, I'm going to debunk a couple of myths. First of all, one thing to understand is that historians estimate somewhere around 12 million slaves were transported along this thing called the Middle Passage, which the video below here does a very good job of explaining. And so I won't go into too much depth into that. And your activity does talk about and does engage in talking about the Middle Passage itself. But a lot of people think that the North was not engaged in the slave trade, that it was just the South. And we're going to debunk that because the people in the New England area were actually merchants trading slaves. So a lot of rum was made in this area. They got the molasses and the sugar from the West Indies, and it went up into the New England area, and then that was traded for rum for slaves. And slaves were mostly taken to the West Indies and Brazil. Actually, about 80% of all the slave trade went to the West Indies and Brazil. Brazil took the most number of slaves in the slave trade in the Middle Passage, with a whopping 60% of them. The Americas only took about 6%. Now, that does not mean that the hands are clean of America at all regarding the slave trade, because, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about the Constitution, and the deals that were brokered at that point, because in 1808, this was actually outlawed. It was outlawed in the Americas. And what happened was that, think about this, they weren't, the Chesapeake area needed more and more slaves, and we'll talk about why that was at that time. And they couldn't trade them because in 1808, it became illegal to engage in the Middle Passage. Not that ships didn't sneak in otherwise, but what happened was that intentional breeding began to occur. And as disturbing and as upsetting as this really is, this really happened quite a bit in the Americas. And internal slave trading was completely legal, of course, until the end of the Civil War. Some states had outlawed it, but in the South, of course, not. And so just because America didn't engage as much into the Middle Passage does not mean that its hands were clean at all of this. But I just wanted to give you a big picture of this. So if you hear rumblings about this on the internet or things like that, you understand its actual origin. So just a moment ago, I talked about the origins of it. I just talked about this, the fact that there wasn't a large slave population in the 1600s. It was not very many. Actually, we had more indentured servants in the United States early on. In here, the number states, only about 5% of British America Blacks existed in that area. So this really begins to change in the late 1660s. Laws were starting to mimic Barbados slave codes, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. But basically, they started differentiating between race and indentured servitude and things of that nature. And they also created a system. Now, even though in British America, everything was patriarchal, right? Everything was down. If you inherited your father's name, it was a patriarchal line. They decided to make the status of slaves matriarchal. In other words, if your mom was a slave, you would become a slave. So those laws started to pass in some of the Chesapeake areas like Virginia and Maryland. And so we start to see this really change. But I will argue that probably one of the most significant events in the United States to change the status of there weren't very many Blacks in the United States to the intentional breeding of Africans and more growth from the Middle Passage was an event known as Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. Okay, so I'm going to try to break this down as simply as I can on this event. So essentially, in Virginia, which was where Jamestown was and everything like that, the people there, about 2/3 of them actually were indentured servants. And if you might remember from our talk on indentured servants, the idea was that you would get freedom dues, where at the end of your 7, 8, 9, 10-year contract, you would get a certain amount of land in your freedom from serving, right? And so by the time many people began to come in the late 1600s, a lot of the good land, and I say that with air quotes, was taken. And so they got a lot of lands that were occupied by Native Americans. Now, the new indentured servants were quite upset about this because they ended up having to fend off Native Americans who were rightfully and understandably upset about people trying to take over their land. And the indentured servants led by a guy who wasn't even an indentured servant. He was a guy that immigrated from England, a guy named Bacon. Yes, his name was Bacon. He actually comes over and launches this indentured servant rebellion because he's upset about the land that he was given. He was given kind of crappy land along with the other indentured servants. He wasn't an indentured servant, but he led them. They were the ones that were chiefly upset about it. So they literally overthrow the governor. No joke. Like, torch Jamestown down, burn the city. It never really recovers from that. And the British government has to come in. And before the British government gets there, before the ships get there, Bacon dies of dysentery. It's kind of a weird thing, but he ends up dying. But, the British imperial system restores order. But this is the important part, and this is where slavery comes into this. Indentured servants were white. They were white British subjects. And for that reason, they were given British rights. And so what a lot of people on the plantations began to realize that even though indentured servants were generally less expensive, they were more trouble because they had rights. Okay. And so that's when we start to see this change over and more reliance on slavery. Like I said, I argue that Bacon's Rebellion was super significant in that. In addition to this, the laws that begin to form in Virginia and Maryland, this particular event really changes things. Now, like I mentioned before, Maryland and Virginia start to model slave codes after what was seen in Barbados at the time, which is in the West Indies. And they start to, legalize and start to pass laws regarding who was a slave, who wasn't a slave, and slaves seen as property at that time. Slaves themselves, there's a lot of studies on this. I don't have time to go into everything related to this, although it's a vastly interesting subject. They did resist. There were instances of slave rebellions, and I'll talk about the most significant one here in just a minute in the Americas. But mainly it was what's known as passive resistance, where they would purposely slow down work. They would fake illnesses to not work. Women, many times, there's lots of evidence to state that slave women would feign a pregnancy to get lighter work or less work or no work. Many slaves would passively resist by breaking tools and things of that nature. So resistance did exist, very much so, okay? But probably one of the things that I bet you never heard of is an event known as Stono's Rebellion. So this happens in 1739, and this was a group of slaves in South Carolina that came from one region of Africa that literally launched a rebellion. And they were shouting liberty as they marched down, and they would beat drums. That was the warrior call in the particular region that they were at in Africa, to call more slaves out to rebel. And they literally went farm to farm and killed plantation owners and their families, and essentially, and I say terrorize them because that's essentially what they did. Their goal was to make it to Florida, because Florida was a Spanish colony by that time, and they had outlawed slavery. So they tried to make it down there, but they are caught. They are killed, they are executed, their heads were cut off and put on stakes along the road. Okay, much like they did to the Native Americans after King Philip's War. There is a video that is really good, and I put it here below too about Stono Rebellion. But I hope that gives you a little bit more insight, a little more context into the origins of slavery.